Hello YouTube, this is Morgan, Airspeed Prime here with my next Avatar discussion video. Once again, I think we kind of have to have the is Aang a bad or terrible father discussion once more. I think I've discussed this twice before in the channel, but of course I think the last time was like 2 years ago. But of course on Twitter, if you're on Twitter and see some of the Avatar discussion, the discussion came up quite heavily kind of yesterday, today, and I think we need to go through it again with some of this stuff in mind. So, what started all of this? Well, what started it was this tweet. I'm not going to link, and as you can see, I've kind of covered over the kind of details of the profile that actually tweeted it. The whole point of this is to address this opinion, not the individual who posted this opinion. So this tweet, I think, just happened to appear on the timeline of, I think, a lot of people. And so that explains, the over 2,000 quote tweets and so many comments and stuff like that. But what the tweet, as you can see, is making Aang a terrible father is still one of the worst things they ever did. So straight away, you can sort of see the issue here of like, one, wait, since when is Aang a terrible father? And making Aang a terrible father, so that it was a purposeful decision on behalf of like the writers, it's a bit of a like, don't really agree with that. So I try on Twitter not to overly get involved in the big Twitter discussions, for the main reason that I don't really feel Twitter is a particularly great place to have these sort of in-depth discussions, because of the Twitter character count just means hot takes are going to be flying all over the place, because you can't say as much as you want in one tweet, and no one reads most of the... If you do a like 2 or 3 tweet thread, you notice the amount of interaction with the lower tweets doesn't really happen. So if you don't say what you need to say in like your first tweet, it feels like you're not involved in the discussion. So I think it's important to get more in-depth discussion in a video like this. As you can see here, what I responded with was just this. My issue was mainly with the use of the word terrible, and so I said, not perfect does not equal terrible. Look at how they resolve this in the very episodes it comes up in. Look at future content with these characters. Kaya even notes she talked to Aang about her sexuality and he supported her. Clearly the actions of a bad father, ... of course. And then I posted 2 images, which was, of course, the family photo, as well as the scene that I referenced from Turf Wars. For this, because a lot of people aren't familiar with the comics, so it's important to have. And then I posted the family picture because it seems like, with the episodes that people are referencing to get to the whole terrible father aspect, it seems like a lot of people have conveniently forgotten how this plot ends in Civil Wars Part 2. We will get to it. So my tweet did, for me, this is probably, I think, potentially the most popular thing I've ever tweeted out, just with regards to the interaction. But of course, there were people who responded and were critical of what I had to say for like a variety of reasons, which was, to me, a little bit weird, because I do view this as being a pretty wild take. To use the term terrible in relation to Aang as a father, seemingly putting him into the same category as truly bad fathers in the Avatar universe like Ozai or Yakone, is just not particularly great. That is a purposeful word there that to me is over the top, hyperbolic. It's a hot take. And my point here, I don't think there's anything controversial in it. I'm just literally saying that terrible is not the right word, not perfect, I agree with. I'm not saying he is a perfect father. I didn't even say he's a good father, but we'll have this discussion. And just pointed out that there are other scenes other than the one that clearly is being referenced. So, the first bit here. I want to address this thing, because someone responded early on with a nice point, sort of like also disagreeing with the overall tweet, was the idea that it seems like nuance is sort of lost in certain aspects of the Avatar fandom. And that's the whole point of this is a nuanced topic We can be reasonable about this and be reasonable in our interpretation of scenes and not always like assume the absolute worst to get to the Aang's a terrible father sort of conclusion. There are opinions that go beyond just 0 and 10. It doesn't have to be terrible. It doesn't have to be perfect. And this is the case in terms of, like, in this case, beyond great father and terrible father. So, first of all, let's address what has been said by the creators, the writers and stuff like that. The word of Bright, whatever you want to call it, word of God. Basically, what has been said by the creatives in interviews, or in this case, in episode commentaries. So, in The Civil Wars Part 1, where this whole discussion pretty much comes from, Part 1 and Part 2, Joaquim dos Santos, Mike DiMartino, and Brian Konietzko are on the commentary. And we get to the section, of course, which we'll go into and analyze in a second. But they talk about this in some depth. There's a lot of text here, but I have highlighted some of the more important points. So Joaquim points out that he notes the sort of dynamic that has come up between these characters who are all over 50 years old acting like more typical siblings. That is part of the dynamic of this episode. And Mike points out they don't see each other that much. And so a lot of old resentments and the way they acted as kids still comes up because they haven't totally worked through all of that stuff. That's very much in line. If you've watched Civil Wars Part 1 and Part 2 in any way recently, that interpretation, what Mike says there, is the writing intent, and it comes across in the episodes. Brian says, yeah, I guess if people really found this upsetting, I guess they just aren't at that stage, because again, I'm the youngest of 5, and it's definitely what goes on, with my love all my siblings. But so again, it's a transcript of them having a conversation with each other, which is why there's a lot of kind of ums and ahs and sort of like pauses. But Mike says, you have to be clear. We were never trying to say, like, Aang was a horrible, terrible parent. It's more about how Kaya and Bumi, like, interpreted, Aang's absence. Because he was busy, he's a busy guy, he was being the avatar, and then it was just kind of this natural thing where he ended up taking Tenzin around the world because he was the vessel for his legacy. The last, and second to last airbender at the time, wanted to make sure his culture continued on. And so it came from that place of keeping our nomad culture going on, which was important. So maybe he overlooked spending some quality time with the other kids at one time or another, but it didn't mean he was like a deadbeat dad or something. And Brian goes on to say, yeah, I think that's a pretty exaggerated interpretation if people read it that way. I mean, I guess again, it's just that they don't want the image of that character that, they maybe love, like, tainted in any way. But when you and I have ever been interested in presenting any of our characters perfectly, so the idea of would it be interesting at all if it was just, oh yeah, happy fun times, Kataang family, no problems whatsoever, in that, like, they kind of used the fact that, like, things weren't ideal to help to characterize all of the different siblings in their own way. And that's what they kind of talk about here. Brian goes on to talk about, like, another instance of this kind of situation happening. And that is the, Korra being unreasonable in early book 2, which is another sort of relatively, hot take style thing that I don't think people have a particularly nuanced take on it. And he just points out that there are moments for Aang in, like, say, book 2, where he is also sort of like that. And good characters can make bad decisions, bad characters can make good decisions. They're interested in having a bit of a kind of balance type situation. And he, again, goes on and says stuff like, if I had these responsibilities and the responsibility of raising kids and trying to be a good parent, it doesn't mean you're a bad person or you were out to neglect your children. It's just that it's life. It's what we're always trying to deal with in our shows, is balance, trying to find a balance. And, Aang had a hard time dealing with all of his responsibilities, trying to be the avatar and to keep peace. There's only so many hours in the day, trying to be a good parent, pass on the culture and stuff like that. So that is the writing intent. And in many ways, like, that resolves it. It is the opposite of the creator's intent, with those scenes to come out of it with the idea that he's a terrible father. And they discuss some of the nuances there. Now, obviously, a lot of people, if you do feel Aang comes across badly from these episodes, you're probably not going to be maybe super happy that, well, the discussion is over just because the creators talked about it in an episode commentary. But this is where we have to actually just do the full-on more kind of fan analysis style thing. So let's go through some of these episodes. So we're dealing with book 2 here, which is primarily when we get introduced to Kaya and Bumi. We only see a tiny bit of Bumi in the previous season. So in the first episode, Rebel Spirit, you just get some of the dynamics being presented. This stuff isn't particularly important. I tried to pick out nearly every kind of scene that kind of involved Kaya especially, but also most of Bumi's stuff as well. So this just presents the dynamic between all of the characters, because again, this is, I think, an important thing to realize as we discuss this. These episodes are not just like on this side of the plot. It's not just the siblings criticize Aang. There's a lot going on in this episode, in that it partly focuses on the dynamic between the siblings themselves, in that they kind of end up sort of in the beach-like-esque way, kind of almost taking shots at each other and criticizing each other, as well as occasionally bringing up Aang. Similarly, in other aspects of the episode, we see other family dynamics come into play. So that's the theme of the Civil Wars episodes, and that's kind of what we build up towards. Because again, an overall theme, especially actually throughout all of Book 2, is family. So a family-related plot here does make complete sense. So they're not just sticking this in here randomly. This is part of an overall bigger picture, and in this case, most heavily is the start of like Tenzin's character development arc, as we'll see. So towards the end of the first episode, we get this interaction between Tenzin and Katara. And he's like, I need to spend some alone time with my family. But Katara points out, this is your family. They're your siblings, your brother and sister. When you get to be my age, you'll be thankful for the time you had with your siblings. It's important that you all visit your father's home together. Come on, it'll be fun. And so they go out on this trip together with a little bit of optimism. So that is quite good. And then we get to, like, say, K202, the Southern Lights, the second episode. Someone brought this up. I didn't think it was a particularly strong point, but it's this idea that when they arrive at the Southern Air Temple, there's this scene where Bumi and Kaya get off the Sky Bison, and this one random acolyte doesn't know who they are. And the point that was being made to me on Twitter was like, well, this confirms that like all of the Air acolytes don't know who Bumi and Kaya are. And I'm like, look at the scene. It's just this one female character. Like, it's the only character who actually makes this kind of point. And sure, you can kind of interpret it as that maybe that is representative of how most all feel. But there aren't other scenes that actually commit to that, and that they otherwise don't know them. Especially as the series progresses, we see Kaya and Bumi at the different temples quite a bit, and it seems like they're known. So I felt like this was just sort of meant to be a contrast. In this specific instance, Tenzin and his immediate family get this amazing reception, and then Kaya and Bumi getting off right at the end, kind of the last people to get off, just happened to get ignored by one person. And it's meant to set up a little bit of the dynamic going forward, that in a way, when it comes to the airbender aspect, have they been left out, and what does that mean? What, like, Tenzin is so much the focus on this side of things and not them. But it is important to realize that I think it comes across quite clearly that Bumi and Kaya both didn't necessarily want to be super heavily involved in the air nomad side of things, while Tenzin did. But we will get there. So that's that point. Then we get into Civil Wars itself. So again, a few notes on this one. It's just note the multiple family-related plots. Ikki has issues with Jinora and Milo. That's a plot point here as well. They have to go searching for Ikki, who runs away. And that's in this side of the episode we're talking about. This is very heavily related because the Cloud siblings team up to search for the Air siblings, the Air kids, together. And they basically do this dual kind of plot as we go through it, of like, when we get to the resolution stuff at the end, it's the younger kids, the younger siblings, who resolve things very quickly. And then in a way, the adults see that example set by the kids and decide to put their issues aside as well. But we also get we get Tonraq and Unalaq, the brothers. Tonraq and Korra are at odds throughout, like, say, episode 2 and going into episode 3 and 4 as well. Korra and Senna have probably one of their most notable scenes in the entire series here. And again, of course, the Cloud siblings themselves with each other, as well as with Aang. So we get into these scenes and we get, okay, Vacation Tenzin here. Tenzin wants to spend time with his family. And then we get the kind of start of what people are going to bring up as being the main proof of the Aang is a bad father thing. I've really enjoyed having you two around. Reminds me of all those great vacations we took as kids with Dad. And Kaya says, your memory's a little foggy. Bumi and I weren't on those great vacations. It was always just you and Dad. That can't be right. What about this instance? Nope, we weren't there. What about Ember Island? Remember those places? No, you built them. We never saw the place. And Tenzin just says, I could have sworn, as the scene ends. And look, this is the point. This is valid. This is obviously not great. We don't know the full context behind like every single situation with regards to, like, say, what ages the characters were at this point in time, what like Kaya and Bumi were up to, like, necessarily, you know, did they want to go? Were they just not even asked to go? Like, there is stuff to this that doesn't like explain the full situation, but absolutely, just on the core of how it's presented, this is one of the main negatives against Aang. And it's like, well, why is this the case? And we'll get into it as we go forward, but obviously the idea seems to be that these are trips that Aang took Tenzin on to, I suppose, basically help to train him to be the next leader of the Air Nomads. And they also had some fun vacation times along the way. So there's that. Because I saw a few people bringing up the idea that Aang is such a bad father that it also impacts the dynamic with Tenzin as well. That Aang puts all the pressure on Tenzin to be the successor, when Tenzin directly says here he enjoyed those vacations where it seems like he also did, I guess, a lot of his airbender kind of training or learning stuff about the culture on these trips as well. So then we get to this little scene here. They all go to search for Iki together. So immediately, this being presented here doesn't immediately cause issues. They do begin to work together to go and find Iki. Then we get into that here. And this is where the next bit comes up. The first sort of beginning of the sort of sniping at each other happens. Why would she run off like this? It's probably my fault. Probably. So Kaya lays it in there. I'm guessing you've been so busy with your duty to Republic City that you forgot about your duty to your kids. And Bumi makes the duty joke here, of course, that was referenced in the commentary transcript that I mentioned up above. And Tenzin notes that, yeah, you are right. I haven't been spending enough time with them. I wish I could be as good a father as Dad was to us. And this is what makes Kaya even more angry. Tenzin, your problem is you're exactly like Dad. He was so focused on saving the world and doing his duty, don't laugh, that he never had time for us. And now this is an interesting one, because this is obviously a criticism of Tenzin and of Aang. And at this point in the story, would you necessarily say that like Tenzin has a bad relationship with his kids? And that he's a bad father? I wouldn't say so. He acknowledges that he should be spending more time with them probably, and that he could be doing better. But again, that's the nuanced take on it. Of like, this is not a situation where I think you just take these straight up criticisms from Kaya and immediately assume they're a level 10 problem that makes a character a bad father. I just don't think it particularly comes across that way. In that, in this case, she uses quite strong wording here. She uses never had time for us. And Tenzin notes, he was under a lot of pressure, which is true, but he always had time for you. And this is where we get into, like, it seems like this is kind of more of the issue between the siblings, is that I ultimately get the impression that I think the kids understand to a certain extent that their father was this very important person. He was the Avatar. He was trying to restore a nation which the world needed for balance. At the same time, it's like either the build-up to or the early days of Republic City. He's needed there as well. And he's trying to balance his family. I think they get that. It's just, in a way, their annoyance is almost more placed on Tenzin specifically in my mind than Aang. Because, like I said, this plot is dealing with both of these things. It's the siblings' relationship with their father, as well as with each other. So, precious little airbender, Dad loves us all equally. Why are we even talking about this? And Kaya, this is again somewhat harsh from her. Because you have some grandiose delusion that we had some perfect, happy-go-lucky childhood. Guess what? We didn't. And again, like, this is sort of in a way the point. Like, the wording that I used was not perfect. And that is effectively what Kaya says here. Of like, she is just disagreeing with Tenzin with the idea that our childhood was like absolutely amazing. Like on that 0 to 10 scale where 10 is absolutely terrible. Tenzin's like, it was a 0. No, it was great. And she's just pointing that it wasn't exactly like that. But we'll see. Remember this one in particular, in relation to what am I doing here? Why did I just do that? Here. Sorry, misremembering some of this stuff. Where's the highlighter? Here we go. Remember this one in the context of the resolution of Civil Wars Part 2. And the sort of contrast of like, right here, heat of the moment, in the middle of the argument, she's saying this versus kind of what ends up being said between the siblings at the end. And then Tenzin refocuses on going after Ikki, which is correct. And Kaya notes that, running away. I think this is a little bit of a weird one where it's just kind of really like he's looking for his daughter. Like, I get it, he does run away from the conversation here, but they are also trying to find Ikki and they're kind of worried. So there's that. This is sort of the Kaya Bumi team up on Tenzin, and we'll sort of see that kind of change. We'll see the different groups of the siblings kind of team up on the others. So here is sort of Tenzin criticizing Bumi a little bit, where he doesn't like his far-fetched stories and stuff like that. Then this is where we get up the whole Bumi kind of criticism from each of them. They obviously have to go up and down this kind of pretty dangerous situation, which is fine for the benders, and they have like movement-based abilities and stuff like that. And you can see this sense of, because he's the only non-bender at this point in the family, he feels like he has to kind of make up for that by being so kind of brave and kind of bold with his actions. And they're like, we could just help you up. It's fine. We're just doing a search here. This is not necessarily the time to prove yourself. But he feels the sort of need to do it and sort of like play up a little bit in this situation. And he nearly badly injures himself. And you can see here a little bit, Bumi kind of, being like, you're not my mom kind of type situation. So it's very much not the case that these scenes are just focusing on Aang, in that a lot of this is just like back and forth between the three of them. You haven't changed since we were kids. You're still trying to prove you can do everything a bender can. Well, you can't. Deal with it. That's an interesting thing, because you wonder how much did that affect Bumi not being a bender at all in the family, not water or air. You're not our mother. You don't get to tell me what I can and can't do. Just good luck healing yourself without that. And then Tenzin comes in and says his piece on Bumi. You're the oldest of us, but you always acted like the youngest. I had to become the responsible one. Now, they focus more on this, but I find it interesting that Tenzin does say this, and I think it does come across that way in the dynamic, that Bumi, in a way, like, gets to be the kind of fun uncle, where the other two are a little bit more serious, a little bit more responsible. But this is interesting what they discuss here with regards to this. Tenzin thinks he's the responsible one. Kaya says, where were you after Dad died and Mom was all alone? Because I was the only one who packed up and moved my whole life to be with her. And Tenzin says, like, sure, after years of flitting around the world trying to find yourself. Because this is the thing where, like, you know, we don't have that many, especially with Kaya, that many scenes that particularly, like, characterize her. I think we probably have enough with Bumi where we know kind of like, okay, these are his strengths and weaknesses. With Kaya, we start to get a little bit of a sense through these scenes about, like, what her flaw is. And you'll notice that she mentioned, like, kind of the idea of duty before, and you can sort of say that here, of like, this is a character who has potentially avoided kind of finding a specific, like, duty for herself, that she hasn't wanted to, as Tenzin says here, it was time for you to settle down, and she didn't until, you know, something like the death of Aang actually happened. And he points out, you've no idea how it feels to have the future of an entire culture on your shoulders. Bumi again brings up the, you know, flying around with kind of dad situation. That's what it's all about. It's what it's always been about. You think you're some savior who has to carry Dad's legacy. And this is an interesting point, because at this point, based on the dynamic here, you think that what Kaya would say next would be something that's a little bit more focused on criticizing Aang, but it's actually, the core issue seems to more be Tenzin, as he feels he's the only one of the three who has to carry the legacy of Aang and felt any pressure, in a way, having to live up to Aang. And this is where they bring up, how about all of us? And ultimately, what is the takeaway from, I'd say, like, the entire series of Korra? Where do all three of these characters end up? And the reality of it is that basically from this point on, book 2, 3, and 4, Tenzin, Kaya, and Bumi are together a lot more often in the content that we see. It seems like Kaya actually decides to basically effectively stay at the Air Temple Island quite a lot of the time and be a leader of sorts there to sort of organize things and stuff like that. And Bumi, of course, given that he gets airbending, and then, you know, we get the reveal throughout this book that he's actually quite spiritual himself and is a natural leader. He's also suited to be a leader. So what happens is that you do get this kind of rough idea that the three siblings gradually go on to become the three aspects, in a way, of the legacy of Aang, continuing it on. They all lead in their own sort of, like, specific way. Tenzin is your overall leader because, you know, he's your airbender. He has the family. He's been at it the longest, knows the history and stuff like that, but is lacking in certain areas you'd expect of an airbender, which, in a way, Kaya and Bumi make up for, because Bumi is just, like, sort of naturally spiritual. Kaya is sort of spiritual in her own way, like a little bit kind of more guru aspect, whereas Bumi seems to just have raw natural spirit abilities, sort of like Jinora does. And together they make a nice leadership structure kind of for the New Air Nation going forward. And I think, you know, this is a very telling line, I think, to have here. Absolutely. So they obviously basically agree to leave at this point. They go off on their own. And then we get into the Civil Wars Part 2, K204. So Tenzin eventually finds Ikki and they just start having a conversation together. And there's some interesting stuff here. Ikki mentions Bumi and Kaya. And this is a nice scene because what we get here is effectively each of them criticizing their own siblings to the other, but the other praising what has just been criticized. So Tenzin talks about the positives of his other children, and Ikki talks about the positives of Tenzin's siblings. So, you know, let's not spoil it. What do you mean? Aunt Kaya is super nice and pretty and always asks me how I'm feeling. Uncle Bumi is like the funniest person in the world. And Tenzin's like, what about Milo? He's hilarious too. You never know what's going to come out of his mouth. And Jinora can be so sweet and gentle. And then this is the key. Absolute key here. This one here. Let's mark this in orange here, just to kind of make it really, really clear. This is the theme of this episode. What Ikki says here, this is the heart of this episode. And in a way, I think what you are meant to take away from it. And we'll get to how they resolve things in this episode. Tenzin agrees. And then this is also important. This one is also very, very important. But I guess the nice part about a family is they'll always be there for you. Even though Twinkle Starchild and Princess Rainbow fight, they still love each other. And I think the idea is that this is meant to apply to what they've literally just talked about here of Tenzin and his siblings, Ikki and her siblings, and the issues. And the idea is that these fights, these conflicts, these civil wars that pop up in families sometimes are just like this. And I think Brian alluded to this idea as well. He kind of mentioned that like he was the youngest of 5, I think, and that you can have these things where like you maybe say things that seem exceptionally harsh, but because you know your family more than almost anyone, it doesn't mean as much as it would be if you said it to like a stranger, that sort of thing. And I think that's what they're getting across here, is that they're going to be there for you despite the fight. And that's what is happening in this episode ultimately. Bumi and Kaya were helping him to find Ikki, and they do still care. That's important. So then we get an interesting Bumi and Kaya scene here. So, I'm sorry I didn't turn out to be an airbender like you hoped, but I tried my best to keep the world safe. I hope I made you proud. And again, this is one of those ones where I think people were sort of misusing this one a little bit of like, I'm sorry I didn't turn out to be an airbender like you'd hoped. The sort of like you hoped. And I think it's not exactly correct to interpret this as Aang said something to Bumi about this. Like, I think this is very much Bumi, and in a way, like what we got from that, all of the siblings in their own way, feeling like they haven't quite done enough to live up to whatever legacy, whatever, like, bar they've set for themselves as being a son of Aang. And I think this is purely all on Aang, and sorry, not on Aang, on Bumi. I don't think Aang would ever have said anything to Bumi about him not being a bender, or especially not being an airbender. I think this is very much a Bumi thing. And I think the fact that Kaya, who has been the most critical of Aang throughout this conversation, she is the one to come in and say, of course he'd be proud of you. So it's moments like this of like, I think people often use the idea of like, Kaya is very critical of Aang. She's the one who says their childhood was less than perfect and stuff like that. He was never around. But she can still talk positively enough about her father to be like, of course he's proud of you. He doesn't feel that way. This is the kind of nuance of it, of like, that to me is assuming it's taking the absolute worst from this scene and not at all what is, I think, actually presented in any of this. And I think you see this with the way, like, say, the Tenzin arc goes, in that it's like, I never wanted you to be exactly like me. You are you. You are Tenzin. That's what that spirit of Aang says to Tenzin. Is I, you know, in a way, I'm not trying to set you an unassailable bar, which is me. Just do the best you can do. And I think there's that understanding of like, they all help each other to understand that about themselves. And we'll get to some other stuff as we go on here. So nice moment between brother and sister there. Then here's the sort of resolution to all of this. So Pema is like, okay, do you want to say something to your sister, like Milo and Jinora? Glad you're back. Sorry we made fun of you. And then boom, Ikki is like, thanks, want to play airball. That's the resolution to something that made Ikki run away in a place she has like never really been to before and caused a bit of an issue. Potentially this massive thing, but no, they resolve it near instantaneously because they're family. These things happen. They fight, but it's not as serious as you could maybe interpret it to be. See the nuance? And then note what happens immediately after this. Like, in a way, the adults are looking over there watching this happen. Tenzin especially has just had the conversation with Iki, who has just accepted this apology, and he realizes that, in this case, I think I'm the one who needs to apologize. I want to apologize for how I acted yesterday. I've worked so hard to celebrate Dad's legacy that I may have overlooked the parts of him that were less than ideal. And again, less than ideal is not terrible. It's just this thing of, I feel the need to point out every single one of these slight nuances, because to me, nothing here gets anywhere near the word terrible or even bad. And then Kaya says, look at what Kaya says. And we're sorry for dumping our frustrations with Dad out on you. So they sort of in a way apologize that we are frustrated with aspects of our childhood, but we shouldn't have really had this. And then, you didn't deserve that. And then Kaya says, I thought you wanted to see this. Mom gave this to me before we left. And it's the picture. So if we go up here, it is this picture. Kaya shows them the family portrait. So let's just go back down to that, and we'll, So that's one good-looking family, huh? That's one happy family. And that's how the episode ends. On this side of the plot, that's how Civil Wars Part 2 ends. And what's the follow-up to this? Do they come back to this topic? Do they address more of these issues? Do they talk more about how bad Aang was as a father? Do they even fight with each other that much in the coming episodes? The answer is no. And so this is basically the resolution to this within basically the entire series. There may still be some issues that these characters still have about their childhood, but it definitely feels like at this point they look on, I think, the wording here, just trying to find the right words here. I think they look on a reasonable amount of what they feel frustrated about and maybe haven't talked about in quite a while with each other as being little moments like this. And I think this is where we'll also go back up to the quote stuff here for this. Where is it? A lot of old resentments and the way they acted as kids still comes up because they haven't totally worked through all of that stuff. And I do feel that the end of this is, for the most part, them working through that stuff. That is how I interpret it. Is there room for a story where maybe more of this gets addressed? Absolutely. But I don't come out of Civil Wars Part 1 and Part 2 with the idea that Aang was a bad father at all. And look, there's a few more things to address here as we go forward, but let's just progress here. So in 205, it's mainly a Tenzin Milo focus on this side of things. He bonds with Milo, again addressing the idea that he needs to spend more time with his children. So he's been holding Rohan quite a lot throughout these episodes. He had a one-on-one conversation with Iki in the previous episode. He has one-on-one time with Milo here. And then we have the whole guide situation with Jinora as being the Jinora aspect of that arc, which is basically what happens in here. I think Kaya and Bumi are in scenes in other episodes, but there's nothing of note from those things. So it basically gets to the idea of Korra coming back into things. There was this interesting one looking through the transcripts of the episodes, and I found this point of when the reveal comes out that Tenzin can't actually meditate into the spirit world and is not actually inherently spiritual. He says, "It's my greatest shortcoming as an airbender, spiritual leader, and son of Aang." And Bumi is like, "Welcome to the I Disappointed Dad Club." And they kind of move past it straight away. Again, Bumi says it in a bit of a kind of fun, joking tone, and I think especially it being directed towards Tenzin, who is viewed as being the kind of perfect one of the siblings. I think Bumi is just like, hey, it's not all perfect for your airbender aspects. And again, like I talked about before, who of the three actually goes on to be the most spiritual? It's Bumi in terms of raw spirit interaction, and then you'd almost say in some ways Kaya is kind of a more naturally spiritual person than Tenzin as well, especially because she at least has this kind of little bit of an arc in this episode where she is the one to sort of notice before anyone else that Jinora has some weird stuff happening around her. Because we know like that they have this close connection, that they, and then this is another point, like they mention it, I think in one of the previous scenes, dialogue I didn't put in the document here. They mention that, you know, you should take the kids to visit us more often, basically. Highlighting that they at least go to see them occasionally. It's not that they haven't spoken in so long, like say Lin and Sue and Toph and that whole dynamic. That this is someone that they get to meet occasionally. And Kaya and Jinora actually have a quite notable kind of connection. So then we get into the moment where Tenzin is trying to be the spiritual guide to Korra. It is not working. He gets frustrated. And Kaya's just like, stop being so stubborn. It's not your destiny. I think Jinora was meant to do it. And he gets very protective as a father. But Jinora speaks up, says Kaya is right. And he becomes very reasonable about this. Of just like, perhaps I'll never have these connections like my father wanted me to have. Jinora says it's okay. I'm proud of you. And he lets her go on. So that's like Tenzin's growth. In a way, like informed by his siblings, and you get a little bit of Kaya focus there. You do get a bit of Bumi focus here, because like the whole kind of Boomju kind of thing happens, which leads to Bumi's sort of big scene in the 4-part finale for book 2 that we have, and so on. You get to see Kaya in action in like the finale, doing quite a bit of healing, and so on. This scene is quite interesting because again, we're doing a little bit of a character analysis piece on Kaya and Bumi here as well. When they're in the Fog of Lost Souls, when they've been in there for a reasonable amount of time, Kaya begins to kind of lose it a little bit. And so the idea seems to be that you're kind of, it seems to be some sort of a weird thing where one of your like darkest fears or something like that gets like brought up when you begin to become very much affected by the fog. And Kaya's like, who are you two? Kaya, we're your brothers. You must remember before the fog infects you. No, you're just a vision. I have no family. You can't tie me down. And again, this fits in with some of the other stuff with Kaya. The idea is that she, at some point, had a bit of a nomadic exploration around the world, where she wasn't around her family for a couple of years, and only came back into things when she heard about what happened to Aang. And this idea of you can't tie me down. And the idea of like her having like frustrations with, say, Tenzin and Aang about them sort of being tied down to a certain degree by their duty. And so she traveled in a way maybe to not have that same duty. It's interesting because like it doesn't get brought up all that much like as like a character point. It's a bit weird, I suppose. You know, you have the whole, you get to see Zhao during this. You get to see Bumi talks about like cannibals. And there's obviously the implication that there were some crazy incidents that did actually happen during his time in the United Forces, which I suppose I'll bring that up now. I saw other people very much interpreting the whole situation of like, oh, there's a big point. Both Bumi and Kaya basically left the family to get away as soon as possible. And the problem is, we have no actual like canonical stuff that actually tells us the details of, say, how, why, in what circumstance Bumi actually came to join the United Forces. There's an almost joking, it might actually be true thing where like I think Bolin says like, let's just put him in a potato sack and like carry him away. And Bumi's like, well, that's actually how I came to join the United Forces. They like put me in a potato sack and like enlisted me in. And I guess he just stuck around because of course he's like a commander. So he does quite well for himself. And then there's this idea that like, oh, Kaya escaped the family. And again, there's an aspect of like, we don't know exactly the full details for it. Maybe it is because she is the most impacted by kind of what happened with her kind of childhood. Maybe it relates to her kind of, discovery of her kind of sexuality and stuff like that. It's hard to say without them explaining like what exactly happened. So again, I think it's hard to have either an opinion, particularly either way, on that whole idea of Kaya's nomadic kind of trips around the world. It did seem like it's sort of a thing where like that's how she sort of established herself around the world as like a good healer and aspects like that. But again, I don't think you can use that as just a sort of like it doesn't mean anything. But I don't also think you can turn it into something that means everything for the discussion. This is the other thing I posted. And I think a lot of people kind of misinterpreted me when I was pointing this out. I maybe could have worded it slightly differently. But the idea of this, obviously, is that we've just had scenes where Kaya, most of the time when mentioning Aang, has sort of mentioned him in a kind of negative light. Here is a scene where Kaya talks positively about Aang, and it is about something very personal. A lot of people try to dismiss it as like, well, it's just the bare minimum of Aang that you'd expect that he accepts her, basically. But it's not quite exactly what is said here. They talk about, you know, like, how did Aang react when you told him? And she talks about how he was nothing but supportive. He didn't just accept it, he was supportive. And it's that idea of, if she had a bad relationship with Aang, and this is like, I guess, in her teens when she potentially would have, this scene would have happened. So this is like after much of their childhood, when these issues that they're talking about would have happened. She still felt comfortable enough to go to him, talk to him about a very personal issue. And if there was a problem with their dynamic, if she thought of him as being a bad father, would she have done that? That's the main point I'm getting across here with this. It's just, that's a pretty notable thing to talk to someone about, and that she specifically mentions, how did Aang react? And she mentions that. Then we'll get into clearing the air a little bit in terms of, it is another instance where we do get to see Aang as a father. Now, I get some people are going to mention the idea like, oh, it's an Aang Tenzin story, what about Aang with the other kids? And it's like, sure, but the idea here is that in terms of addressing that point of, was Aang needlessly, like, say, strict on Tenzin, or in a way, did he put pressure on Tenzin to be the next in line leader of the Air Nation? And so that's what we get here. So they get on Appa here, and this is what we get. You know, Tenzin is very frustrated, very serious, and we see that this is an aspect of who Tenzin kind of is and always has been. He puts that pressure on himself. We see that in the show. Like I said, the scene in the spirit world where he talks to Aang, and they address this whole idea. I know you're going to tell me that this is why I haven't earned my arrows, because I'm not supposed to get angry or use my bending to attack, even when they deserve it. They deserved it, and I'm supposed to keep the Air Nation culture alive, but because of them, I couldn't even protect airbending gates. And Aang says, Tenzin, the gates aren't important. You are. You could never let me down, just as you could never let the Air Nation down. We live on in you. I'm sorry that you have to bear this responsibility, but I trust you wholeheartedly with it. And so, if you're up for it, I'd like you to lead us in resolving this conflict. Traditionally, the head monk would oversee all disputes and help both offender and victim come to a fair resolution, and Aang will guide them through it. And so we see that actually happen. Aang acts basically as head monk here and guides them through it. And as we see here, he talks to Katara. I wish it was always this easy to keep the peace, but he's young, let him have the easy ones for now. And look, he made friends. And we see that going forward, Tenzin is having to deal with similar things with his own family. And so again, it's another one of those situations pointing out that idea of, you know, little conflicts within families. These are the type of things that happen. But you can see Aang being a good father here. And I think the final thing to discuss here is sort of Aang and the whole idea of him being busy. Let me get the quote up where Tenzin, I guess, talks about it, just so I have something relevant on screen here. So that's in this episode. It should be just about here. Yeah. Dad was always under a lot of pressure. And again, they talk about it, I think, more heavily in the episode commentary bit that I mentioned. And I think this is the point that you have to have here. So we've talked a bit about the whole sort of Kaya Bumi thing. They are absolutely valid to have these complaints about what happened in their childhood. But there is also a sense that it seems like they are things that, at least at this stage of their life, they are able to, for the most part, move past because they are family. They don't hate each other. It wasn't so bad that it was ripping the family apart. Kaya can still talk positively about their father, and mention like aspects that weren't so great, but also mention good times as well. Again, nuance here. The same, I think, has to hold true for any sort of analysis on Aang as a character and analyzing the pressure that he is under. Because I think there's a big sense to very much diminish, not talk about, address, or really even acknowledge the kind of insane position that Aang is in at this point. That, like I said before, he's the Avatar. Are we forgetting about the fact that he's the Avatar and has one of the most kind of tricky, difficult jobs effectively in the world, where on any day, any week instance, he will be asked to go to X nation, X town to potentially help to resolve, mediate, discuss whatever issue. And he's the only Avatar, so he's the only one who can do it. When you're dealing with politics between nations at times and stuff like that, this is what's going to come up. So, being the Avatar, huge thing. 2, he is trying to rebuild the Air Nation, which again is something that I think people almost dismiss in the middle of all of this. Like, the whole point of Avatar, one of the main themes is balance. Are we suggesting that he just not try and do that? I don't think so. So that's correct. Like, the world needs to have airbenders back for the sake of balance. Like, that was the whole thing. Aang's the last airbender. We can make it so that he's not the last airbender. So when he eventually has a child who is an airbender, of course he's going to train him. Of course he's going to focus a lot on that aspect. And when it comes to the whole, I suppose, balance between the kids, there is also this sense of like, we don't know the exact specifics about how he went about, say, like, with Bumi. Did he try to teach Bumi air nomad culture stuff, or Kaya, or what? The impression I get, especially with the way Aang is in like the comics and stuff like that, is that Aang, in general, I don't think is a person who wants to force his culture onto people. He doesn't do it with Katara in their relationship, to the point where Katara almost feels like she needs to almost put a little bit more effort in to learn about his culture. That's how, in a way, almost little he brings it up. So that's why I think Katara is quite supporting of Aang in situations kind of like this. So I think Aang, acknowledging that, say, like, Bumi isn't an airbender, I guess it was one of those things where, like, do you want to learn this stuff? I will teach you if you want. Because the impression you get is that both of them, both Bumi and Kaya, know a reasonable amount, more than your average person, about air nomad culture, because they know about like different gurus and stuff like that. But the general impression you get is that they find it boring. Even Bumi, when he becomes an airbender, still finds it boring. So it seems like it's that sense of like, the role for them was not to be trained in the exact same way as Tenzin. And I guess this is just that weird thing of like, okay, Aang may be considering like, you won't want to come on this trip because sure, there'll be some fun times, but a lot of it will be going through old temples and me just kind of talking about different gurus and ideals of air nomads and stuff like that. And do you guys want to sit through that while all this other stuff is happening? We also don't know what ages the characters were when this happened, because you do have to acknowledge that, like, for instance, there seems to be a 10-ish year gap between, say, Tenzin and Bumi. So if this is when, like, say, Tenzin is 10 years old, Bumi is like 20, maybe over 20, and he might have already joined the United Forces, like, at this point. Or if they are talking about younger, even if he was like a teenager, you know, there's a sense of like, he might not have wanted to go on those trips. Now, to be fair, the way the situations are presented, it does seem like they just weren't brought on the trips. Like, what is the exact wording? Let's go back to this a little bit. So, vacations we took, we weren't on those vacations. It was just you and Dad. We weren't there. We never saw the place. So again, they never actually talk about the specifics of like how those trips were like organized and stuff like that. So maybe it was just a set thing where it was like, this is the airbender trip, and they just never considered to ask the others. But again, I think there's probably some nuance there, and like kind of Mike and Brian were saying in their comments, that there's an element of like resentments from the past, and maybe and I think this is very true, the idea that they are remembering the times they weren't included, and not really remembering the times where they were included. I think there's some element of that, but again, the idea is that we're not talking about 0 or 10. We're talking about this kind of nuanced situation of being sort of somewhere in the middle. So again, going back to Aang, Avatar, rebuilding the Air Nation. 3, Republic City, I think, is also an important thing. Now, that's an aspect of being the Avatar, but it's also another aspect of like nation building as well, depending on what exact year and stuff like that we're talking about. But it's still something Aang was heavily involved in, a nation of nations that he basically has to be involved in. They live kind of right next to it and so on. So there's that. And then, of course, having time for his family as well. That's 4 massive things, massive things for him to deal with. And I think it is very unfair if you just dismiss that and say, just very bluntly, he should have spent more time with his children. In that, like, sure, yeah, absolutely. Like Tenzin, he should have. But could he have? Would it be okay for him to, like, not do that Avatar thing that he had to do, that he was required to do, that was revolved around like world peace? That's what it comes down to. It's that balance of time. If he spends tons more time with the kids, then stuff related to Republic City, stuff related to the air temples doesn't happen. And again, we don't know a lot about the details of this. That has to be acknowledged in all of this. And I think that is a criticism, I think, more at the franchise in general, rather than like Korra in particular, this book of Korra in particular, this episode. I think it's just the franchise in general not covering a lot of the kind of time period in between Avatar and Korra. Even now, as we go into Avatar Studios, of course, we know the movie is going to be set somewhere in that timeline, but we don't know, based on what we know, it's going to be them as young adults, which I think, based on the ages and the way it will work, I don't really think the kids will be involved in this. So we're still probably at that point going to be waiting to get more content that actually involves the Team Avatar members as parents. So I think that's more of the kind of like general complaint here, is that like I would like to see more comics that like address it and have stuff like, say, Clearing the Air, like I referenced there, and has more of that in-depth analysis to it. So yeah, I think that's most everything I want to talk about here. So I think you've seen that we've gone through this, and I think we've been pretty fair with what we've had to say about everything that's happened in this. And to me, after going through all that analysis, making Aang a terrible father, I just don't get it. I think that's a crazy opinion. And it's exactly why I said what I said. And what I said is, I think, still very reasonable. It's not a hot take. It's just, can we acknowledge that nuance exists in this situation? In that, like, I think some people interpret what I'm saying here as me trying to create the opposite point to this, making Aang a perfect father, when I'm not saying that. I'm just saying we can come back from 10. Please, be reasonable. So I think that's all I want to say. In the comments, let me know what your thoughts are on this topic. Other than that, that's been the video. Thanks for watching, and bye.